Hello. In this video, I'll talk about how to use the Qlik OAuth impersonation framework as authentication method. This is typically used when you want to embed Qlik visualizations into your own portal, meaning that they are hosted in an app in Qlik Cloud, but presented in your own context, and you have your own login mechanism already in place. It is important to note that this framework eliminates the issue with third-party cookies in modern browsers. There are two different ways of implementing this, and this video will cover both. So let's get started with the first method. So the first method is assuming that you are running in a Node.js framework. In this case, we have the Qlik API NPM package you can install, which makes it a bit easier for you to use the OAuth integration framework or authentication framework. So basically what you need to do here is that you need to run npm install and install the package at Qlik /API. When that is done, then you need to import it in the beginning of your file where you want to use it. And you can see from Qlik API, I'm importing users and auth, and I'm using later on, as you know, the naming I'm using for it later on is Qlik OAuth and Qlik users. Then I predefine some config values, and the auth type in this case will always be OAuth2. The host name is, of course, where the Qlik Cloud instance is, including the protocol. The client ID and the client secret, which is returned in the Qlik Cloud instance when you configured the OAuth client in there. It's important to note that these parameters can be hard-coded like this if you are in a single tenant environment, meaning that the host is already the same, and in that way the client ID and client secret should not move either. However, if you are in a multi-tenant setup, which is very normal for OEM partners when they have a tenant for each customer, this needs to be dynamic, so you have these values hosted somewhere in your backend, and depending on which user it is, the host name will be that specific user's company's tenant host name, and the corresponding client ID and client secret for that specific host, right? Because the OAuth client is created in the actual tenant, so that will be different from tenant to tenant. All these things can be spun up via APIs as well, but this will not be covered in this video. Now, when you have this in place, then the first thing you want to do when you have like a user, in this case I'm using the filtered email as the unique identifier for the user. So you want to check if the user already exists in the tenant. So you can see here I'm doing a filter on the user email. I have a parameter where I'm importing the config values we saw earlier. In this case, this was hard-coded, but again, it can be dynamically in multi-tenant setups. And then I define the scope I need for this specific call. This will either return an empty array if a user with the email does not exist, or an array with the user having that email and with the all the data around that user from the tenant itself. If the user does not exist, then we need to create the user. And if we want to create the user, there's another call in the library called create user. And in this case here, we are giving the user's name, email, subject, and we set it to active straight away. It will always be like that in an SSO setup. And then you are using the config values again and set the scope for the call. So that will return the new user, and then the user ID for that specific user will be available for the next call. The next call is actually to get the access token. So the access token will again take the it's not using the Qlik user here. We are using the Qlik OAuth, the other one we imported from the library. Again, it uses the predefined config value, and then it uses the user ID, either return from the get user if we found a user there, or from the create user if the user were not found in the get users call. And then we're saying that the scope for this should only be user default, because we don't want to give this access to do admin tasks in the tenant, of course. And then it's actually ready to go. This is what's being used in the front end from the Qlik embed framework to start importing the visualizations or showing the visualizations in a portal context. If we jump to a non-Node.js environment, meaning that you are, instead of using the wrapper around the REST calls, you have to do the underlying REST calls yourself, then you have to start with getting an access token for the admin tasks. The way that is done is that you're calling your tenant ID. This is just a curl, so you can turn that into whatever programming language you wanna use. You have your client ID and your client secret here as input. The scope is admin classic and user default, and the grant type is client credentials. This call will actually return an access code, which then give you access to do the get user call, and that is a get call where you have the filter in the URL, and then in the header you have the bearer token returned from the post call over here. Again, maybe you find the user there. If you do, you will have the ID for the user to get the access for the user later on, the access token. Or if the user is not there, then you again have another call. Actually, it's the same endpoint as up here is the API v1 users. API v1 users is just a post call. Again, we're using the bearer token returned from the first post call up here. And then you give the name, the email, and subject status for the user, and it will be created. And again, you will get the ID in your return values. And the last thing here is that you want to get the access token for the user. In this case, the access token call is the same URL as you saw for the post call up here. However, remember that the header should not be presented with the token from up here. You should rather use the client ID and client secret from your OAuth client in the tenant here. You have the grant type specified, as you can see here. Scope is user default, and then you do like a user lookup on the user ID, and then you actually put in the value field here. That will be the value either returned from the get user or from the create user call. So that's the way it works if you are using REST. It's important to note that the get user and create user call can be kind of done when the user logs into your portal, not even trying to access any visualization at any point. Whereas the get access token is a call coming from the front end, where when the front end wants to kind of get access to present the charts, then it sends in a call to the back end, and then it says, I would like an access token for this specific user. This is returned, and then the user can start seeing the visualizations. So the code looks like this in the front end. So if you want to implement visualizations, then you can see that you download the Qlik embed web components from a script block in top of your HTML page, and then you have the host client ID, which sometimes need to be dynamic as well. We have other videos where we show you how to do that. But then the get access token is actually meant to be a function call. So you can see that down here we have a get access token function. That function called the backend and get the access token back again into this parameter, and then we are ready to return the visualizations on the front end. If you want to read more about how to do this and the documentation around it, I will recommend you to go to the Qlik.dev webpage, where we have all our developer documentation for development subjects, so to speak, on Qlik Cloud. But let's try to dive in and see how this looks in code. I have already imported or installed the library Qlik API, so I ran npm install Qlik API, and I got it in here. So then I'm importing the auth and the users from that library, calling that Qlik auth and Qlik users for the remaining part of the code. Here I have a constant config where I'm defining the auth type to OAuth 2, which should always be the case in these scenarios. Then I have a host, a client ID, and a client secret. In my case, they are predefined in a config file. However, these should be dynamically defined in a multi-tenant scenario where different customers got different tenants. In this case, you have to specify the tenant for the user you want to log in, and the related client ID and client secret for that tenant. So now let me try to jump to a web page and log in so we can see what happens in the code behind. So I'm logging in now, and what we can see here, the first part of the code is calling an internal function called get Qlik user. I will just jump into that one, and here we can see we call the first call from the library. So Qlik users get user. We are filtering on an email, so we are looking if that email exists in the tenant already, and then we are returning the user. As the input parameter down here, you can see we have the config variables, which are taken from my hardcode value specified earlier. Remember, some of them can be dynamic in multi-tenant scenarios, and the scope for doing this call. In this case, I'm using the user default and the admin classic scope. So we can see the user returns a data array of 0, meaning that we don't know that user in the tenant already. Now let's just go back, and we can see that our current user is exactly what we just got back from that function. We are looking if the data array is not equal to 1. We will either have 1 user or 0 users, because we cannot have multiple users in the same tenant with the same email address. In this case, this is not equal to 1, it's 0, because we didn't know the user. And then we go into the create user function from the library again. So Qlik users.create user. We're specifying the name, the email, the subject, and the status active. As this is SSO, we want to make it active straight away. Again, we have the config values and the scope admin classic and user default. Further on, here we are from that function, we are now got the data with all our inputs we sent to the function, and we also got the ID back again for this specific user. So that's the unique ID for that user in that tenant. We are saving that into a session variable called user ID, and now we're actually done with what happens on login time or in the back end when you just know who the user is. And now it will take a round trip to the front end where it wants to show the visualizations, and that front end page will request an access token. So if I'm continuing the code, we will see it's coming back asking for an access token. So first we are getting the user ID from the session variable, so we know who the user is. And let me just continue here. Boom. So then we are calling the Qlik auth get access token again with the config variables. Now we are adding the user ID as an input parameter as well to tell the function which user we need to give access to the application. And then in this case, the scope is only user default, because we don't want to give this user access in the tenant at all. They only need to do the standard user function, so to speak. And we can see an access token now is returned to the front end. So I'll just continue here, and if we go back into the client now, we can see that we got different way of integrating the charts now, and we can see it in the front end, right? All right, let's try to jump back to the server and kind of restart the debugging here, and then back into the web page, which is right there. And now it doesn't know my user again. And what we'll try to initiate a login with the same user. So what we can see now is that we're doing the same thing. We are going into the Qlik user function, and in this case, I expect that the user will return something in the data array, right? Because we already know the user with that email. So coming back into the function here, the data length is equal to 1, so it will just go to the else statement. And the only difference here is that it will take the current user data, and then it will take the first object in that array and return the ID from that into the session user ID variable, instead of just taking the ID directly, because when you create a user, you just have one entry here. It's not an array. Here it is an array. So that's the only difference. The remaining part of the code will be the same. So we will see it's coming back now, requested an access token as we just saw before. We can just continue. We're going back, and the user will be logged in, and there we go. So this is how it works from VS Code. So let's try to look at how it works if you're doing it with the without using the Qlik API library, but doing it with the REST calls. So if we want to try to do the same thing with the REST calls, then I have a Postman collection here which kind of can demonstrate how to do that. So we have actually 4 calls here which are simulating the process, also identical to the steps we saw on the slides earlier. So the first thing you need to do is to get an admin token on the OAuth/token endpoint on the tenant. In here, I have the client ID. The client ID secret in the body. It's a post call, and then the scope admin classic and user default scopes, and then the grant type is client credentials. So if I run this one, I get an access token back, and what we just do for simplicity here, this access token, we are picking that up in the test here and put that into a collection variable, which can be used in the subsequent calls here. So the next thing we want to do, because now we got access to kind of using the REST calls, right? We got an access token. So what we can see here, we have another endpoint, which is now API v1 users. We put the filter on it on the email we want to look for. It's a get call. So there is nothing in the body, of course. And authorization, we are using bearer token, and we are taking the token we exported or we saved in the token variable. What it basically does is that it will put it into the header as a bearer token right there. So if you run this one, it will say that this user exists in the tenant, and this is the ID, and you can continue for getting a token for that ID. If we were looking for a user which were not in the tenant, then we go like this, and the data array is empty. So let's say that the data array was empty like this, and we want to create the user. Then you can go into the create user call. That is actually the same endpoint as we had up in the lookup users. However, this is a post call. And in that post call, you are defining the name, email, subject, and status for that user. Status will always be active when you do SSO. And then authorization is again set to the token we returned from the first call. So if I create that user is now created, and we can see that I got an ID returned, I will put that in my clipboard. And then when we go to the last one, it's the same endpoint as we had in the first one. However, we have changed a little bit in the in the grant type and scope. And now we also have a user lookup where we look on the field user ID and we're looking for the user ID we just returned from the create user. It's important that we don't have the authorization up here. The authorization in this case is done via the client ID and client secret from the OAuth client you have defined in the Qlik Cloud tenant. So if I send this one, then you can see here there is a token which can be returned to the front end, and then we can start showing the visualization out there with the Qlik Embed framework. So this concludes the videos on how you can use OAuth with Qlik Cloud for authentication. I can recommend you to see some of the other videos we have on the Qlik Embed framework and also on how to get started with this OAuth and Qlik Embed in a fast way, so you don't have to start all the way from scratch if you want to play around. And then, of course, I will remind you about the qlik.dev website if you want to read more about the documentation on how to do stuff from a development perspective. So thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.